Hey everyone, I want to talk about something happening just across the border that's raising a lot of eyebrows. Canada's federal government is gearing up to introduce yet another round of gun bans, targeting a wide range of semi-automatic shotguns and rifles. Now, as an American, I've always been deeply invested in conversations about firearm rights and regulation. While Canada has always had stricter gun laws compared to us, what's unfolding right now might set a concerning precedent, not just for Canadians, but for how gun control is approached worldwide. The timing here is important too. This push comes as Canada marks the 35th anniversary of the Polytechnique massacre, a tragedy that continues to influence their firearm policies. I get it. Events like that shake entire nations. But what's alarming is how this latest move, called an Order in Council, or OIC, allows sweeping bans without any real debate in Parliament. It's leaving gun owners in Canada frustrated, uncertain, and feeling unheard. In today's video, we'll break down what's happening with these proposed bans, what it means for Canadian gun owners, and why this story should matter to us here in the U.S. Let's dive in. Before diving into the specifics of this new wave of bans, let's take a step back and look at how Canada's gun laws have evolved over the years. If you've been following this, you'll know that back in 2020, the Canadian government banned over 1,500 models of firearms through an Order in Council, essentially a legislative shortcut that bypasses parliamentary debate. That move was controversial, to say the least. Then came Bill C-21, which aimed to further tighten restrictions and introduce measures like the so-called evergreen definition of prohibited weapons. Now it seems like they're doubling down again, targeting more semi-automatic rifles and shotguns. What kicked off this latest push was a question raised during a recent Parliamentary Standing Committee meeting. Christina Michaud, a Bloc Québécois MP, voiced concerns that the government's current buyback program wasn't enough. She pointed out a potential loophole. Gun owners could sell their prohibited firearms back to the government, then turn around and purchase similar non-restricted models still available on the market. To address this, Canada's Minister of Public Safety confirmed a new OIC is on the way, effectively closing that loophole by banning even more firearms. Now this all comes at a highly symbolic time, the 35th anniversary of the Polytechnique massacre, one of Canada's darkest chapters. For those unfamiliar, this tragedy occurred in 1989 when a gunman targeted women at an engineering school, leaving 14 people dead. The event not only rocked Canada, but became a pivotal moment in its gun control history. Over the years, it's been a reference point for policymakers advocating for stricter laws, much like how events like Sandy Hook or Columbine shape our conversations here in the U.S. But here's the thing. While these anniversaries often reignite debates about public safety and gun control, they also create an environment where governments can push through sweeping changes without much opposition. It's hard to challenge these measures when they're tied to such emotional events. That's exactly what seems to be happening now, with the government using this moment to further restrict what firearms Canadians can legally own. What makes this even more concerning is the lack of transparency. In Canada, Orders in Council allow these bans to be introduced without full parliamentary scrutiny. Compare that to how things work here in the U.S. For better or worse, our legislative process for gun laws often involves heated debates, public input, and media coverage. In Canada, these changes can happen almost overnight, leaving gun owners scrambling to figure out what's legal and what's not. So where does that leave Canadian gun owners? Many feel like they're being punished for the actions of criminals, and they're not wrong. These bans seem to target law-abiding citizens who followed the rules, rather than addressing the root causes of gun violence. And as an American, I can't help but wonder how these developments might echo beyond Canada's borders. If sweeping bans like this can happen there, what's stopping similar moves from being proposed elsewhere? Now that we've got the context, let's talk about the specifics of this new order in council and what it could mean for gun owners in Canada. So, let's get into the specifics of this new order in council, or OIC, that's being proposed in Canada. For those of you who aren't familiar, an OIC is essentially an executive order. It allows the government to bypass full parliamentary debate and push legislation through quickly. While that might sound efficient, it raises some serious concerns about transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to something as contentious as firearm regulation. From what we know, this new OIC is aimed at banning a broad range of semi-automatic rifles and shotguns. These aren't fully automatic weapons or anything close to what most people think of when they hear assault weapon. These are commonly owned firearms used for hunting, sport shooting, and for some, even home defense. The government seems to be targeting what they're calling the gap list. That's the term they're using for firearms that were missed during the sweeping ban back in 2020. What really stands out here is the government's approach. Instead of addressing specific public safety concerns or involving a transparent advisory process, they're effectively doubling down on their original ban. The gap list implies they're backtracking to catch firearms that didn't make it onto the 2020 list. That makes me wonder, if these firearms weren't considered a problem back then, why are they suddenly an issue now? It doesn't inspire much confidence that this is about public safety. It feels more like a political move, one that targets law-abiding gun owners rather than addressing the root causes of gun violence. Another aspect of this new OIC is its focus on closing the so-called buyback loophole. The government's concern is that people participating in the buyback program could sell their prohibited firearms, take the compensation, and then purchase similar guns still on the market. To prevent this, the government plans to ban the sale of those similar firearms altogether. While I understand the logic, it also raises an important question. How far does this go? If every time a new firearm hits the market, it's deemed too similar and banned, at what point are gun owners left with no legal options? Now let's talk about timing. The Minister of Public Safety suggested that this new OIC could be announced as early as the 35th anniversary of the Polytechnique massacre. To me, this feels more like a calculated political maneuver than a genuine step toward improving public safety. By tying this announcement to such a tragic event, the government creates a narrative where opposing the ban could be seen as insensitive or even disrespectful. It's a smart move politically, but it also makes it incredibly difficult for gun owners and advocates to challenge these measures without being vilified. What's also concerning is the lack of clarity on enforcement. Based on what's been shared so far, this new OIC could involve a task force working with the RCMP to identify and confiscate prohibited firearms. This isn't just about banning new sales. It's about actively going after guns that people already own. The buyback program will provide compensation. But let's be real. Compensation doesn't replace the value or utility of these firearms for the people who own them legally. And the idea of police knocking on doors to enforce these measures is bound to create tension between law-abiding citizens and law enforcement. Now, as an American, I can't help but compare this to how firearm regulation happens here in the U.S. While we have our fair share of debates and challenges, most major changes involve a legislative process that includes public input and transparency. Even when executive orders or agency actions come into play, they're often met with significant legal challenges. In Canada, the OIC process seems almost too easy for the government. It allows for sweeping changes without much pushback, and that's a scary precedent. What really gets me is the impact this will have on Canadian gun owners. Imagine being someone who bought a firearm legally, followed all the rules, and then one day you're told that gun is now illegal and you're expected to hand it over. It's not just about the financial loss, it's about the principle. These bans seem to focus on the tools rather than the behavior, punishing law-abiding citizens while doing little to address actual crime or violence. To wrap up this section, the proposed OIC feels less like a thoughtful policy and more like a rushed, politically motivated attempt to appear tough on guns. It's a move that leaves Canadian gun owners with more questions than answers. Which firearms will be banned next? How will enforcement work? And most importantly, will these measures actually make anyone safer? These are questions worth asking as we dig deeper into this issue. Next, let's take a closer look at the task force behind this OIC and why it's raising so many red flags. Now let's talk about the task force that's playing a big role in shaping this new OIC. From what I've seen, this is one of the most troubling aspects of the entire situation. The Canadian government has created a task force to work alongside the RCMP on these bans, but the details surrounding this group are murky at best. Who's on this task force? What's their expertise? What criteria are they using to decide which firearms should be banned? These are basic questions, yet there's no clear answer. Here's why this matters. Unlike the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee, or CFAC, which was at least somewhat transparent, this task force operates entirely behind closed doors. With CFAC, the membership was public, their agendas were shared, and there were at least some rules in place to keep things accountable. In contrast, this task force seems like a shadowy operation with no public oversight. The lack of transparency is unsettling, especially when you consider the power they hold to determine what's legal and what's not. The government claims this task force is a technical team working with the RCMP, but that raises even more questions. If they're not RCMP firearms technicians, who are typically responsible for classifying firearms, then who are they? What's their background? Are they policymakers, activists, or consultants with a particular agenda? And why are they given so much authority without any public accountability? As someone who values the transparency we demand in the U.S. legislative process, this feels like a major overreach. Imagine if we had an anonymous group making decisions about which firearms Americans could or couldn't own, with no opportunity for public debate or input. It's the kind of thing that would set off alarm bells for anyone concerned about government overreach. What's even more frustrating is that Canadian gun owners are expected to trust this process without question. This task force could be made up of people with little technical knowledge or even an outright bias against firearms. That's not just speculation. It's a genuine concern when there's zero oversight or transparency. This lack of clarity creates an environment of fear and uncertainty for Canadian gun owners. They don't know who's making these decisions or why, and they're left wondering what's next. The creation of this task force speaks volumes about how rushed and politically motivated this entire OIC process feels. Next, let's dive into the broader political motivations behind these bans and why timing plays such a key role. Now let's get into the politics of this. To me, it's pretty clear that these new bans are less about public safety and more about political maneuvering. The timing couldn't be more convenient for the Canadian government. With the 35th anniversary of the Polytechnique massacre approaching, they're trying this new order in council to a tragedy that holds deep emotional weight. It's a strategic move, using a sensitive moment to push through a controversial policy. I'm not saying the tragedy shouldn't be remembered. It absolutely should. But using it as a political tool feels manipulative. Here's the thing. The current Liberal government has been struggling in the polls. Recent attempts to address economic issues haven't landed well with the public, and their approval ratings are sinking. So what do? They pivot to gun control, a reliable way to rally their base and shift the focus away from other problems. Sound familiar? We've seen this playbook here in the U.S. too. When a government needs to change the narrative, controversial policies like gun control often take center stage. But here's where it gets interesting. While this might be a short-term win for the Liberals, it could have long-term consequences that backfire. In Canada, like here in the U.S., firearms aren't just tools. They're symbols of individual rights and freedoms for many people. Every time the government tightens restrictions, they alienate a significant portion of the population, particularly in rural areas where hunting and shooting are part of the culture. By pushing these bans, the Liberals risk energizing their opposition, especially among conservatives and gun owners who feel targeted and marginalized. This could also have major implications for Canada's next federal election. If the government continues down this path, they may force the Conservative Party to take a stronger stance on gun rights. Historically, Canadian Conservatives haven't always pushed back aggressively on gun control, but this could change if their base demands it. Think about it. If these new bans include widely owned firearms like the SKS, it could spark a massive backlash that forces the Conservatives to promise sweeping reforms to Canada's Firearms Act. In other words, the Liberals' actions today could lay the groundwork for a future Conservative government to undo these bans entirely. From an American perspective, it's fascinating to see how the political dynamics around gun control play out in Canada. In the U.S., our Second Amendment makes sweeping bans like these much harder to implement. But in Canada, where firearm ownership is seen more as a privilege than a right, the government has far more leeway. That said, Canadian gun owners are not powerless. Political pressure, public advocacy, and grassroots movements can still make a difference, especially if these bans are seen as excessive or ineffective. And let's not forget the practical implications. These bans won't just affect individual gun owners. They'll also hit the firearms industry hard. Retailers, manufacturers, and even gunsmiths stand to lose a lot if more firearms are banned. For many in the industry, this feels like a death by 1,000 cuts, with each new regulation making it harder to stay in business. Ultimately, this new OIC feels like a high-stakes gamble for the Canadian government. It might win them some political points in the short term, but it risks alienating gun owners, energizing their opposition, and deepening divisions within the country. Next, let's talk about why this matters not just for Canadians, but for Americans and gun owners everywhere. Now let's zoom out and talk about why this matters, not just for Canadians, but for all of us, especially here in the U.S. To some people, what's happening in Canada might seem like just their problem. But in reality, the decisions being made there could have ripple effects that stretch far beyond their borders. Whether you're a gun owner or someone who values individual rights, there's a lot to unpack here. For Canadian gun owners, this new OIC represents another step in a long pattern of increasing restrictions. The government's approach feels like a slow but steady march toward making firearm ownership so difficult and restrictive that it's effectively banned for all but the smallest, most tightly controlled group of people. These policies don't just impact criminals, who are unlikely to follow any law, but the law-abiding citizens who've played by the rules every step of the way. Here's where things get tricky. Canada doesn't have a Second Amendment. Unlike here in the U.S., where our right to bear arms is constitutionally protected, gun ownership in Canada is treated as a privilege, not a right. That gives their government far more power to enact sweeping bans like this. For Canadian gun owners, It's a constant uphill battle to protect what little freedom they have left in this area. Imagine trying to advocate for your rights when the legal framework doesn't even recognize them as rights in the first place. But this isn't just about Canada. For us Americans, what's happening there should be a cautionary tale. Policies like these can set international precedents. Activists and lawmakers who support stricter gun control in the U.S. often look to countries like Canada or Australia as examples of what they want to achieve. When Canada implements a new gun ban, it becomes a talking point in our own debates. If they can do it, why can't we? That's the argument you'll hear from gun control advocates, and it's why we need to pay attention to what's happening north of the border. At the same time, the philosophical differences between our two countries are worth considering. In Canada, gun control is often framed as a public safety issue, an effort to prevent tragedies like the Polytechnique massacre. While safety is also a big part of the debate here in the U.S., we have the added layer of individual rights. For many Americans, firearm ownership isn't just about hunting or self-defense. It's about a fundamental freedom that's deeply tied to our national identity. That's why sweeping bans like these would be much harder to pass here, though that doesn't stop some from trying. What's also striking is how these policies are rolled out. In Canada, orders in council allow the government to bypass public debate and push through significant changes with little opposition. Imagine if something like that were used here in the U.S. The backlash would be immediate and overwhelming. We demand transparency, and even when we don't agree with the outcome, the process often involves public hearings, debates, and court challenges. In Canada, the lack of transparency in processes like this new OIC leaves gun owners feeling powerless, and that's something no one should accept. From a practical standpoint, these bans also raise important questions about their effectiveness. Will banning more firearms really make Canada safer? Or will it just push people to find alternatives, either legally or on the black market? In the U.S., we've seen time and time again that criminals don't follow gun laws. Banning certain firearms doesn't prevent crime. It just makes life harder for law-abiding citizens. If anything, the more the government restricts firearms, the less trust people have in its ability to protect them, leading to an even greater divide. For Americans, this is a moment to reflect on the importance of protecting our own freedoms. What's happening in Canada could very well become a blueprint for future efforts here. That's why it's so important to stay informed and engaged in these conversations. Even if you don't own a gun, the principles at stake, like individual rights, government transparency, and public accountability, affect everyone. To wrap up, what's happening in Canada is bigger than just a policy change. It's a sign of how quickly governments can move to restrict freedoms when they don't face pushback. For Canadians, the fight isn't over. For Americans, it's a reminder to never take our rights for granted. Next, let's talk about what you can do to make a difference. Whether you're in Canada, the U.S., or anywhere else, it's easy to feel disheartened when you hear about sweeping bans like this, especially when they come without much public debate or input. But here's the thing. This fight isn't over, not for Canadians, and certainly not for those of us in the U.S. who are watching closely. As frustrating as this situation might be, it also presents an opportunity to rally, organize, and make your voice heard. For Canadian gun owners, the path forward starts with staying informed and engaged. Join organizations that advocate for responsible gun ownership and that have the resources to challenge these bans in court or through public advocacy. Grassroots movements have a lot of power when people come together with a unified message. Whether it's writing to your representatives, participating in peaceful demonstrations, or simply having conversations with friends and family to dispel misconceptions about firearms, every bit counts. The more people understand how these bans affect law-abiding citizens, the harder it will be for politicians to push through unjust policies. For us Americans, this is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the freedoms we enjoy shouldn't be taken for granted. Pay attention to what's happening not just here, but globally. Support organizations that protect Second Amendment rights. Educate yourself about the issues, and vote for candidates who align with your values on firearm ownership. Staying silent is not an option. Every voice matters in these debates. Most importantly, don't lose hope. History has shown that policies like these can be challenged and overturned, especially when they're poorly thought out or politically motivated. Whether you're in Canada, the U.S., or anywhere else, the key is to stay vigilant, stay active, and never stop advocating for your rights. Together, we can make a difference. So, where does this leave us? Canada's latest push for more gun bans is a stark reminder of how quickly governments can act to restrict freedoms, often with little transparency or public input. For Canadian gun owners, it's a frustrating and uncertain time, but it's also a call to action. Organizing, staying informed, and pushing back through legal and political channels are the best ways to ensure your voice is heard. For those of us in the U.S., this is a valuable lesson. The rights we enjoy under the Second Amendment are unique, but they're not guaranteed without constant vigilance. What's happening in Canada shows how fragile those freedoms can be when governments decide to act unilaterally. It's up to all of us to stay engaged, support organizations that defend our rights, and educate others about why those rights matter, not just for gun owners, but for everyone who values personal freedom and accountability. At the end of the day, this debate isn't just about guns. It's about principles. It's about the balance between public safety and personal freedom, and the kind of society we want to live in. Let's make sure we're all part of shaping that conversation, wherever we are. Thanks for watching.